I will indeed try to be concise.
C-15 does not go as far as you would want. Yesterday, we had a long series of witnesses from the U.S., and I understand that the U.S. structure of sentencing using MMS is in another world as what C-15 is contemplating. But we've heard witnesses telling us it doesn't work. It doesn't work to the effect that the trend is going in the other way, trying to get rid of MMS and going into more rehabilitation, giving a more focused effort by the court to really tackle the problem individually. We even had a witness, Mr. Sterling, from I'll tell you, the Criminal Justice Policy Foundation from Washington, who told us the biggest driver of the violence is the prohibition itself, not the substance. So what do you say to that?
Okay, well, one of the things I am reminded of again, assuming that we decriminalized, and I think that there's a number of reasons other than this whole violence thing that we could be discouraged from doing that. But I'm reminded that, again, 70% plus of what's produced here is for an export market. Prohibition, moving away from prohibition is going to do nothing for us here on that. It is all about money. It's a very easy kind of crime to do. That will not change. The other thing I am concerned about, when I look at what I know about the history of designer drugs, there's a non-stop morphing into whatever the police are on top of. I can't imagine that a government could come up with a regime, a practice, which would allow there to be a sale of drugs that organized crime wouldn't find some way to skirt around and find some variation of that, which is a better product. And again, I'm reminded of the recent news about cigarettes. Cigarettes are legal, and 50% of cigarettes sold to kids in this country are off the black market. I'm not confident that is going to do it.
But please give me an answer on the fact that the mandatory minimum sentences does not work in the U.S. and they've done it for the last 30 years quite heavily.
Okay.
We've heard witness yesterday testimony to the effect that, and I'm quite convinced that C-15 is not even in the same league. But at the end of the day, it doesn't work.
Okay.
They're going to the other.
I think the reason they're moving away in the United States, and I think there's some good reason to do this. I would agree with that, with the move away, and that's simply because, as we all know, in the United States, they send people to jail for too long. They have too many people doing life on the installment plan. It's one thing to talk about what we're doing. They basically created the opposite situation. They've taken it too far. But I would also say that people should be attentive to the crime stats in the United States. It is not true that they have had increases in crime in the United States. For the last 25 of 27 years, they've had year-over-year declines. Simultaneous to that, they've had year-over-year declines in drug use, alcohol use, tobacco use, and that's true for every single grade for students from grade 8 through grade 12. They, on that front, despite all their problems and things we might not like about their sentencing practice, have done extremely well. I've also looked extensively at what goes on, at least in Washington State, our neighbor. When you think about it, what's different between growing something in British Columbia as opposed to growing it indoors in the United States? I mean, the houses are not entirely unalike. They could do that. They had, for those 10 years that we were studying, they had virtually no grows in Washington State. They had virtually no hydroponic shops, and which were associated to grows, and here we have thousands of them. I don't think that we should too quickly jump to the conclusion that their sentencing practices did not work. If you talk to people from the U.S. Bureau of Prison Statistics, if you talk to people who worked in the U.S. Department of Justice in California, they will tell you that, in fact, that there have been positive aspects to sentencing practices. Now, unfortunately, again, the problem is, and hopefully we never go down that path, they're sending too many people away for too long periods of time. And I'm certainly not advocating mandatory penalties for the sake of stiffer penalties. I'm asking, let's have effective sentencing, and one thing we would all have to concede right now that we don't have here. We are not meeting one single one of our goals of sentencing. We couldn't possibly do it.
I'm not trying to cut you off, but...
I'm done.
Yeah, sorry.
Merci.
Senator Rivet, followed by Senator Wood.
Ma question s'adresse à...
My question is for Ms. Sheehy. Do you think that sentences which are handed down and are reflected in jurisprudence are too lenient? And secondly, do you think that the minimum sentencing proposed by this bill is too harsh? Do you think it's excessive, especially when compared to current sentencing practice?
Specifically speak to would be African Canadian women sentenced for drug courier, importing drugs. And our norm is already to incarcerate those women in spite of the fact that there may be very important mitigating factors that ought to be considered. So, in some respects, these penalties, certainly compared to American penalties, they're not shocking compared to American penalties. But I think by making it mandatory, it does remove from the judge the possibility of recognizing important mitigating and tragic circumstances that ought to nuance the sentence as opposed to setting a minimal standard. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. So in some ways, the average sentence and the benchmark sentence for importing in Ontario is 3 years jail. These sentences are somewhat lower than that. So you might say, well, gee, what's your problem? These are lower than what judges are doing. Well, it's not, judges aren't all doing that. So, it's not a mandatory sentence. It does mean that judges can currently save some people from the ravages of jail. But also, I expect that these sentences are only the starting point. I think if we go down this road, mandatory sentencing for drug laws, I think you can reasonably expect those sentences are going to be raised in future legislation. And that's what I see as a real danger, that we begin to consider this normal for sentencing. And I think that's a risk.
Merci, Senator Rivet. Senator Watt, followed by Senator Baker.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I do have a question that I'd like to put forward. Basically, for your information, I'm just basically saying that we are televised, so people are watching with interest. And I do have a questions. Could you please go back and when you were making the presentation, you talked about how this bill could be damaging or impacting the Aboriginal people in this country. I'm from the north, I'm from the Arctic. I'm not sure to what extent that you might have some knowledge about the Inuit from the far north and so on, that they also they're going to be facing the same law, that is, if this law gets to be passed and so on.